Hi, thanks for having me. This paper got a bit big for its boots between submission and now, so I'm going to have to go quite quickly. Sorry about that. I'm deeply indebted to Chris Bartell yesterday for setting me up perfectly for this talk. So, at the start of his keynote, Chris gave us 3 features that make virtual violence interesting, or that denote what the really morally interesting cases of virtual violence are. The first of those is that we're talking about single-player violence. Multiplayer violence brings in a whole bunch of other stuff that confounds the picture and has some obvious answers. The second is that these are actions that would be immoral if performed in real life. I think that's a direct quote. It's certainly close. And the third is that these are actions that are done voluntarily. What I'm going to argue today is basically that there are no actions that meet the second and third criteria. And that actually the interesting actions in virtual ethics are slightly different. I'm not going to go too much into my argument against the third. It's a bit big. I'm basically operating on a model of agency that doesn't really respect Chris's definition of done voluntarily. That will become apparent as I go through the talk. Most of the focus is on actions that would be immoral if performed in real life. So that's what this diagram was supposed to be about. So the picture here is supposed to be, at the bottom, you've got the real world, in which there is a moral taxonomy of things you can do, some of which are bad. So murder, war, assault, these are bad. They're bad in slightly different ways, or they have ethics about them. And then above that, you have a set of virtual worlds. Different virtual worlds, some in Grand Theft Auto games, some in Call of Duty games, and those are secured to the real world by a relationship that is somehow indicated by the word virtual, and which it seems to me in the virtual ethics literature, people assume virtual is doing the same work in all these cases, and the question is, what is that work vis-a-vis ethics? Particularly, that means we don't need to look at the specifics of individual games in any great detail to judge what the ethics of playing that game is. We can generalise from one or a relatively small number of cases, because what we're interested in is identifying the relationship between kind of virtual actions and real actions, and how ethical weight transfers across that. And so there's this rather overlooked paper by Robert Seddon, in which he argues that this is completely premature to paint this ontological picture, because we have no stability that ensures that virtual is doing the same work in all these cases. I'm working in the same spirit, but a different line of argument. I'm going to start from analogizing the player behaviour in a different way to Chris. So Chris talks about voluntary action and agency. I'm going to use an actor metaphor. I'm going to use an actor metaphor because it's the one I prefer. I'm not particularly going to defend my use of it. I know it's a contested field, but I don't have time for everything. We generally don't think that the actor playing Macbeth is doing something wrong when he performs or simulates murdering Macbeth's victims. Okay? So there is an obvious way in which that aligns with what Chris called amoralism yesterday morning. But there is still an ethics of theatre performance. There are things that you should not do if you are participating in the performance of a play, like use the cover of a stage fight to try to injure one of your fellow performers by failing to pull your stroke appropriately, something like that. And there's a particular case I'm interested in, which is if you are, your agent calls you and says there's a casting call out for a remake of, God forbid, Birth of a Nation, a piece of racist propaganda. You should turn that down. It doesn't matter how desperate you are for work, you should turn that down, because you should not involve yourself in the production of racist propaganda. So that's I'm going to call it symbolic violence, which is full in China shop terminology. Here, by comparison case, I want to illustrate what I mean by that. So I'm going to talk about slurs. I'm going to try to avoid uttering any slurs, because a slur is a word, as I understand it, for which there is no use-mention distinction. If you utter a slur, that's always bad. But there are some complications to this picture, right? The first of which is there seems to be an exception for the group of people targeted by a slur. It seems to be possible for reappropriative uses of slurs. The most famous example of this, or the most debated example of this, is the use of the N-word in rap music. Yeah? That seems to be morally okay, at least when that music is made by black people. And there's another interesting thing with slurs, which is that there are words that seem to fit the definition of a slur. That is, they are negative, pejorative terms targeting social locations or identities or groups of people, which are not themselves slurs. So, limey is a pejorative word for the English. Any of you could call me a limey, and it would not be a slur. It would be possibly a little bit rude, but also we're a nation of idiots. So, it's not a slur. And there's various attempts to deal with this in kind of pragmatics, semantics in the philosophy of language. What you really need, though, is to understand the background of these words. Right? The reason that the N-word is so loaded as a slur is that it comes from atrocities. It comes from the violent colonisation of African nations, the transatlantic slave trade, Jim Crow, the whole tradition of the abuse of black people and black nations by white people. That's what that word represents. And so, what matters to whether it's okay for you to use a slur, first off, it's the material and historical background of that slur, right? It's where does that word come from? The second thing is where you stand relative to that history, right? I'm white. That puts me by default in a particular location relative to the history of white people doing things to black people. If I start throwing around the N-word, I'm doing a thing to black people in a way that lines me up with that history. And that's why it is not okay for white people to use the N-word. But a black person, by default, isn't in that position of alignment. There is some complex, nuanced discussion to be had, which I leave to critical race scholars, scholars of colour, about whether it is possible for a black person to put themselves in a white social location in this regard. It's way out of my lane. And obviously, this theory also explains why there are no slurs for white people, because there's no live political position that stands to white people as white people do to black people. Okay, maybe 1,000 years ago, some groups of white people were traded as slaves. That's not really relevant to the present in the way that the transatlantic slave trade is. So how do we apply that to video games? Well, we need to know both what symbols are going on in a specific game and the identity of the agent. I'm mostly going to focus on the first half of that today. So very quick example before I get into the main example I want to talk about. War games. Yeah? Different wars mobilise different symbols. Even with all respect to the historians in the room, even if wars are all have the same underlying causes, or whatever our position is on the actual causes of war, they invoke different symbols. And it's kind of a joke or a truism in talking about shooter games, right? You could take the same gameplay, the same programming, and put in World War I textures or World War II textures, and one of those gives you a World War I game, the other gives you a World War II game. But they would have different symbols. Maybe you want to say World War I game, 19th century empires, World War II game, 20th century concepts of the nation state. Those are different sets of symbols. And some of those symbols are more live than others, right? We are globally seeing a resurgence of fascism. And it's a fascism that's very interested in its symbols and its symbolic history. So where we put players relative to the symbols of fascism in a game matters to how we assess the playing of that game. So the title of this talk is kind of focused on Grand Theft Auto. The reason for that is because Grand Theft Auto has become this kind of byword for video game violence in the popular press and the popular understanding of games. It's also widely cited in the literature. Almost everyone who writes on the Gamer's Dilemma, which is where I came at this from, mentions Grand Theft Auto at some point, and mentions it as a case which should be taken as standard. Very neatly fits Chris's typology that he set out at the beginning. But I think actually what makes Grand Theft Auto problematic is a combination of 3 features that are quite specific to that group of games, and a few imitators. First of those, Grand Theft Auto is pulp storytelling. It's drawing on a specific populist literature and cinema where, okay, few people have an academic grasp of the whole history of that, but we all know that Goodfellas and The Godfather and those kinds of stories are live in our culture. So it's a particular kind of representation. I'm going to pull out a few features. These are amoral, violent characters. They're particularly associated with immigration, often working class backgrounds. There's often a lot of problematic representations of people of colour, especially in the early parts of that tradition. So that's the first set. The second set is mechanical. It's about the systems that are built into the game. Obvious things like the failure to punish the player for doing violent things. Yeah, okay, the police come out to stop you, but they are built into the gameplay. When the police come out to stop you, it doesn't spoil the fun. There's this whole mode of play of Grand Theft Auto where you rack up as much police attention as you can and see how long you can last. And then when they do get you, when they arrest you or they shoot you, none of the things that would happen to you in real life in that situation happen. You don't get a criminal record. You don't see policing numbers increase. These sorts of things. The third thing that's really important to remember this one, the games themselves as products in the commercial system are understood as violence machines. Okay? $250 million, roughly speaking, went into making and marketing Grand Theft Auto 5. And if you look at the game, most of that shows up in affordances for the player to be violent. When in Grand Theft Auto 4, a bunch of kind of social mechanics are added, where you had to take your annoying cousin to the bar or go on dates. The internet gaming community is lit up with anger. They hated this. So these games are bought and sold primarily as violence machines. And that's relevant symbolism about what's going on in the games themselves. There we go. So it's creating an expectation in the player, or a set of expectations in the player, about what they should be doing, about how their character should behave in virtue of what they do to the game. And what that leads to is the player being encouraged to perform a particular representation of working class and racialised criminality. Why is that important? It's a live issue, right? It's a big part of how oppressive border regimes and border violence are legitimised in our political discourses. Most vividly shown of late by President Trump's rhetoric about the gang MS-13 in response to criticisms of American border controls. And so I'm going to say that no white person should be playing these games, because that's a violent position that white people are taking up relative to people of colour, immigrants, people from the global south. And by playing these games, you're aligning yourselves with that violence. So, 2 kind of responses that we can go with this. The first, and this is a position that exists in literature, some people have tried to defend playing Grand Theft Auto on the grounds that it's satire. I think this can be dispensed with very quickly. Satire is supposed to be humour that makes a critique of something. Point 1, Grand Theft Auto is not very funny. The humour that it does have is very imitative. It's very belly laugh humour. It's not sophisticated. Point 2, I'm not sure what the critique is supposed to be. You can't play Grand Theft Auto and find an argument about how this happens in society. It really just kind of reproduces the image and sneers at it a bit. Stephanie Patridge gives us the idea of the incorrigible social meaning of a symbol. The default meaning that it has in virtue of the culture it exists in, that is very difficult to overturn. If you're going to play with this kind of symbol, you've got to get it really right. And whatever the viability of satire objections generally, I think it's pretty clear that Grand Theft Auto doesn't manage that. You can go the other way And you can say, well, Grand Theft Auto shows that all video game violence is problematic. So my friend John Tilson's just written a paper, which I'm drawing on directly here. It's positioned elsewhere in the literature as well, but John makes it very explicit. He's a Kantian. And so his problem with violence is grounded in lack of respect for life. He says the problem with violence is a lack of respect for life. The problem with symbolic violence is that it symbolises a lack of respect for life. Very straightforward step, don't object to that, but there's another element to what I see as the fault in symbolic violence, which is the position of the person performing the symbols or interacting with the symbols. And I don't think that there is a position relative to all life that is like the position of white people to black people, men to women, straight to queer, able to disabled, etc. Maybe we want to say like President Trump or the Koch brothers are in that sort of position. I'm entirely happy saying they should never play violent games. But I don't think that there is any generalisation of symbolism. I don't think you can render a game innocuous by stripping out its symbolism. As an example of that, I want to talk about a game, full disclosure, by a friend of mine. It's free, it's very short. I'm not making any money off promoting it. Please do give it a try. Things That Aren't Real is a music video game. So things happen on screen in time with the music. You can interact with them, or some of them in some ways. I'm going to talk about the second section of the game, which is kind of understood as a homeward journey. You pass along this promenade overlooking the beach. And this is you in the middle. There are other figures using an identical sprite moving around, controlled by the computer. For the first verse, nothing happens. You can move around, you can't talk to the passers-by, you can't touch them. And then, as the chorus comes in, your character pulls out a knife. Now, there's a small chance that this next image is upsetting, fair warning. Once you've pulled out a knife, there is really nothing to do except be violent. So it looks like what's going on here. And you can stab people, they die, they leave behind corpses, that's the only consequence. Nobody tries to stop you, they don't run away. It looks like the same kind of unstructured, all you can do is kill violence is going on as in Grand Theft Auto here. There's no reason for doing this, but there's no racializing signifiers either. There's no invocation of a cultural location. So if Tilson's argument goes through, it goes through about things that aren't real. But I don't think it does. And the reason I don't think it does is that I think it's still establishing a set of symbolic links. Right? There's no neutral set of symbolic links. And the set of symbolic links that this game establishes, I think, are to other video games. By being a pixel art game that is very obtrusively pixel art, it's the crucial one, invoking the technological history, and also by playing with genre. So the different sections of the game, the different songs, are different game genres. The first one's a scrolling shooter, there's this one, and then there's like a JRPG town at the end. So here's my conclusion very quickly. There is no neutral symbolism. Symbolism is always really specific. If we want to know about the ethics of playing a game, we need to know what its symbols are doing. And then we need to know where the player sits in relation to those symbols. I take it that whether or not that's a simple issue, it's one for which there is an intuitive kind of thing that you can get from there. So, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the talk. We have plenty of time for discussion. Chris,
yes. Thank you. First, I wanted to just briefly mention that the account that you're ultimately defending sounds like a sophisticated version of Patrick's.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I just want to draw attention to one. I just wanted to draw attention to one facet of. So I like the idea that the symbolism of the game, and we need to pick apart the symbolism of the game. But it seems to be a bit more complicated that we also need to pay attention to what the symbolism of the game is doing for certain players, or for certain groups of players. Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, when you mentioned the World War II game.
Yeah.
There's symbolism built into the game. There's symbolism that we could tease apart. But often that symbolism is contextualized by certain groups for their own purposes. And it seems to me whatever moral criticism we have should look at that, like how that group is contextualizing it for their purposes. I'll point out, in the United States today, World War II games in particular are played by a certain very right-wing subset of the population, specifically because it plays into a very nationalistic, very jingoistic fantasy they have about American exceptionalism. That's the problem, not the game.
I don't want to disagree that the player's psychological approach to the game can be relevant. I want to say that it can still be problematic even if there is the absence of that approach. Okay?
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, like that. So it's not just if a fascist plays like a game that lets them play as a Nazi because they want to vicariously experience being a Nazi that's a problem. It's also if like another white person plays that game without like a really careful psychological thing about how they're approaching the game to ensure that they're not relating to the symbols in a problematic way. That's why the slur example is good. Yeah, people keep saying, "Oh, I accidentally said the N word." Yeah, the fact that that word is on your lips is a problem, even if you harbour no actual racist beliefs, or you believe yourself to, or we can prove in some sense that you don't.
Okay, Hyder?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for a great talk. Really, really inspiring. And I was just wondering if you could unpack a little bit kind of the bookends of your talk, because you started out by saying that it's always important who is doing things. In the end, there is that question of if all games should be treated equal. And then you were lumping for the majority of your argument the GTA games together. And I was just constantly thinking about, what about San Andreas, for example? If you have a game that works very much with the situation of the suppression or racial conflict in the 1990s, in reality draws on that and casts you inevitably as a black player character. Does that change anything for you in the way you read that game, the significance you think it has in symbolic items, that you have that parallel relationship always to a person of color?
Yeah, I absolutely think it can. So there's some really interesting writing about, I think it was Mafia 3, which is a similar kind of crime game, but puts you in a historical context as a man of colour, and did a lot of work bringing that to life for you. It's also been talked about in various places in relation to different Assassin's Creed games. I think it can. I still think it requires caution. Like, I think we, in many ways, a lot of what I say here, okay, I'm applying it to the player, but I also want to apply it maybe more so to the designer. I think you can do that work, but you can't ever flip a switch. Right? You can't just say, oh, we'll retexture the main character's skin and that solves all the problems.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about the first line we got on the board. The simple list of the game is always specific and detailed. So do you absolutely reject the idea that symbols might have multiple meanings and floating meanings? And does it mean that everybody reading these symbols would read it the same way?
No, sorry, yes, I see that remark could be taken in that way, and it's not my intention to say that at all. If anything, where symbols are socially vague, so I've talked about examples where the symbols are really socially explicit, person of colour, for example, a really specific symbol. Where a symbol doesn't have that specificity, there's a lot more room for interpretation. And I don't want to deny that at all. I think where you have more room for interpretation, things like what Chris just brought up about the player's mindset become much more important. If I'm playing a completely geometric shooter game, but I understand one of the bosses to be a representation of my father, and I'm doing something ridiculous there, then that becomes problematic, even if there's no default meaning to the symbols. I don't want to deny the point you make at all, but I'm focused on a specific subset of symbols that are very fixed, so I see that was maybe a little incautious.
Okay.
Yes, thanks for a very interesting talk. I'm totally on board with the importance and morality of some specific kind of social, historical, personal position. But it wasn't quite clear to me what it was about aligning yourself with a bad idea that made it that immoral thing to do. Is it only in cases or because aligning yourself with an immoral idea or proposition or value leads to bad actual consequences in the real world? Or if that's not required, just aligning in and of itself with no actual consequences is bad, then why is that bad?
So I was trying to keep this agnostic between consequentialist and non-consequentialist ethics. I think you can give a consequentialist case, right? We can say, well, GTA clearly reinforces this narrative and it's massive, so probably the narrative is really getting reinforced in the real world. But I think you can also give a kind of Kantian case where you say you have a duty to engage respectfully and appropriately with the symbols that you put forward. I could do a virtue ethics transformation, but not right off the top of my head. If virtue ethics is a real
position on it though, just out of curiosity?
Not right now. My exact allegiance to ethical paradigms is in flux at the moment. Hopefully all of them eventually. They all agree on everything that matters.
Yeah, we have time for one short question.
So, my social location as like a human being places me almost inherently like kind of above animals in like a violent way. Like human beings are very violent frequently towards animals, typically to eat them. And a lot of video games not taking place in specifically like the real world, such as Minecraft for example, will have you like kill pigs over and over and over again just so you can gather food. A lot of your examples are very specifically tailored to like harming other people or harming like amorphous blobs with like humanoid shapes. Seeing as I like don't have a way to socially align myself towards animals, I can't ask animals how they feel. Would it always be wrong to symbolically kill them in a game?
Animals are a really tricky case, right? For my whole approach to ethics, I keep running into the problem that the conclusion I have is that animal rights don't matter very much. Or it's always an upshot of my views that animal rights don't matter very much. So I don't have a good answer for you. I am probably less hardline about animal rights than most ethical philosophers, to be honest. I tend to be the one forgetting that everybody else is a veggie when we're suggesting restaurants and stuff. So the problem might just be that I'm too much of a carnivore, and somebody else needs to take these ideas and figure out what to do about animals. Because animals. So have I got time for one quick point? Animals make things really, really interesting because lots of things in games are symbolically animals that aren't symbolically people, that are there to be killed. And then if your argument goes through, then lots of violent games have to be thrown out. Yeah. Which is an interesting position, but I don't have time to go into it. Thank you very much.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you.